Ancient Egypt's golden legends hide a chilling truth. We often see the pharaohs as glorious gods, surrounded by pyramids and untold wealth. That glittering image is a carefully crafted illusion. Behind it lies a world of real terror, where family members plotted murder, rulers demanded worship through fear, and tombs were said to carry deadly curses. By the end of this, you will see these iconic figures in a completely new and unsettling light. What secrets were buried with them, and what brutal acts were committed to protect their power. The story is far darker than the treasures suggest. What does absolute power truly cost a civilization? The most dangerous idea in ancient Egypt was not a weapon, but a belief. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was a living god, the human embodiment of Horus walking the earth. This divine status was the ultimate source of his authority, and it created a system where any action taken in his name was, by definition, holy and just. This belief became the perfect engine for exploitation. Consider the pyramids, those timeless symbols of human achievement. Their construction was not a national project of proud volunteers, as some romantic tales suggest. It was an act of divinely mandated coercion. Vast armies of laborers, often prisoners of war or peasants conscripted into service, worked under the lash in conditions we would recognize as slavery. The scale is almost incomprehensible. The Great Pyramid at Giza contains over 2 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. They were quarried, transported, and lifted into place with nothing but human muscle, ropes, and ramps. The mortality rate was staggering. Archaeologists find simple burial pits near these sites, holding the broken bodies of workers who fell, were crushed, or simply collapsed from exhaustion and disease. Each perfectly placed block at the peak of the pyramid rests upon a hidden foundation of immense human suffering. The architectural glory we marvel at today was purchased with a currency of pain, all justified because a god-king willed it. This divine authority also bred a terrifying culture of paranoia within the palace walls. If the pharaoh's power came from his godhood, then any challenge to him was not just treason, it was blasphemy. The ultimate punishment for such a crime was not merely execution, but total annihilation from history itself. The Egyptians called it damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. When a pharaoh fell from grace, perhaps after a failed coup or a successor's bitter rivalry, the state would launch a systematic campaign of erasure. Stone masons would be sent to temples and monuments to carefully chisel away the fallen ruler's name from every inscription. His statues would be defaced, his cartouches scratched out, his images painted over. The goal was to destroy his soul's chance for an afterlife, as a name was essential for existence in the next world, and to wipe his reign from the record of humanity. This was a psychological weapon of profound cruelty, asserting that not only was the pharaoh's body mortal, but his very legacy could be unmade by the next god on the throne. One pharaoh's chisel became the instrument for murdering another's immortality, revealing a court where brother turned against brother, son against father, in a silent stone carving war for eternal remembrance. The silence left behind in those vandalized tombs speaks louder than any boastful inscription, whispering of the fear that festered even in the heart of the sun god's representative. This divine paranoia did not stop at the palace gates. It seeped into the very heart of the royal family, twisting the bonds of blood into weapons of ambition. In a world where the pharaoh was a god, his closest relatives were both his most sacred protectors and his most dangerous rivals. The throne was worth far more than family loyalty, turning the royal household into a nest of vipers where murder and betrayal were not just possible, but tragically common. Take the boy king Tutankhamun. His golden death mask is a symbol of serene eternity, but his mummy tells a story of shocking violence. Modern forensic examinations, like detailed CT scans, reveal a devastating injury. The young pharaoh suffered a compound fracture of his left leg just above the knee. an awful break that occurred just before his death, but more telling is a mysterious hole in the back of his skull. For decades, this fueled theories of assassination by a blow to the head. While most scholars now believe this hole was made during the mummification process, the severe leg injury alone could have been fatal, caused by a fall or perhaps something more sinister. The question remains, was it an accident or was he helped along? The suspects are all members of his inner circle, his powerful advisor, Ai, who immediately succeeded him as pharaoh and married Tutankhamun's young widow. Or the general Horemheb, who ultimately took the throne after Ai and systematically erased the boy king's legacy from monuments. In the silent, treasure-filled tomb, the mummy itself is the primary witness to a potential royal murder that remains unsolved after 3,000 years. The threat could come from any direction, even from within the pharaoh's own household. Pharaoh Ramesses III, one of Egypt's last great warrior kings, nearly met his end not on a battlefield, but in his own harem. A lesser wife, Queen Tiye, conspired with other wives, court officials, and even magicians to assassinate him and place her son, Pentauer, on the throne. The plot, known as the Harem Conspiracy, was meticulously planned. Court records from the time, preserved on papyrus, detail the trials of the conspirators. They speak of using wax figures for dark magic and attempting to recruit guards to carry out the murder. While the exact method is unclear, evidence suggests the assassination attempt was at least partially successful. Examinations of Ramesses III's mummy in the 21st century revealed a deep, fatal cut across his throat, hidden beneath the burial wrappings. The pharaoh's death was avenged with brutal efficiency. The conspirators were tried and forced to take their own lives, a punishment considered more honorable than a public execution, but no less final. The would-be usurper, Prince Pentauer, was found guilty and given a choice. He could take his own life and receive a burial, or face a more gruesome end. He chose suicide, and his mummy, discovered later, shows a haunting, agonized expression, his body roughly embalmed and wrapped in goatskin, a ritual insult meant to condemn him for eternity. To understand why the palace was so volatile, we must look at the very structure of royal power. Incestuous marriage was a standard tool to keep divine bloodlines pure and political power locked within the family. Pharaohs routinely married their sisters or half-sisters. This practice, while stabilizing the throne in the short term, had devastating long-term consequences. It created a dangerously shallow gene pool. Genetic studies of royal mummies show a history of congenital defects, weakened immune systems, and early deaths. Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of Egypt, was a product of generations of brother-sister marriages. The physical and mental health problems that likely plagued the later Ptolemaic dynasty can be traced directly to this obsessive need to keep power in the family. The royal family tree was not a spreading oak, but a tightly coiled spiral, slowly strangling its own future in a desperate bid to maintain control. The greatest threat to a pharaoh often wasn't a foreign army, but his own mirrored reflection, the brother, the son, or the wife who shared his sacred blood and coveted his divine throne. Even a god-king could go too far, and the backlash would be absolute. The most shocking rupture in Egypt's long history came not from an invasion, but from the mind of a single pharaoh, Amenhotep IV. Early in his reign, he underwent a radical transformation, changing his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. He declared that all the old gods were false. The mighty Amun of Thebes, Osiris of the underworld, the entire pantheon that had structured Egyptian life for 1,000 years, were suddenly obsolete. In their place was one supreme deity, the Aten, represented not as a man or an animal, but as a simple sun disk whose rays ended in tiny hands offering the gift of life. This was not just a new religious preference, it was a scorched earth policy on faith. Akhenaten ordered the temples of the other gods closed, their statues were torn down. The names of deities like Ammon were chiseled out of monuments across the land, an act of damnatio memoriae applied not to a person, but to the divine itself. The economic and social shockwaves were catastrophic. The traditional temples were not just houses of worship, they were the banks, the granaries, the administrative centers, and the employers of thousands, from priests to artisans to farmers. Shutting them down didn't just offend people's piety, it shattered the entire economy. To enforce his vision, Akhenaten turned his back on the ancient capital of Thebes. He ordered the construction of an entirely new capital city, built from scratch in the desert, called Akhenaten, meaning horizon of the Aten. We know it today as Amarna. This was a staggering undertaking, draining the kingdom's resources to build palaces, temples, and villas for a court that had to relocate into the barren middle of nowhere. The distinctive art that flourished there feels strangely modern and unsettling. Gone were the idealized, stiff forms of traditional Egyptian art. In their place were elongated faces, swollen bellies, protruding lips, and intimate family scenes of Akhenaten, his famous wife Nefertiti, and their children basking under the rays of the Aten. This was a deliberate break from tradition, showing the royal family not as distant gods, but as the sole, unique intermediaries between the Aten and the world. For the common people and the powerful priesthoods he disenfranchised, this was a time of profound confusion and resentment. Their entire understanding of the cosmos, their rituals for ensuring good harvests and safe passage to the afterlife, were declared invalid by royal decree. The stability of Ma'at, the cosmic order, seemed to be crumbling because one man claimed a personal revelation. When Akhenaten died after about 17 years of rule, the dam of pent-up anger broke. His successors, including the young Tutankhamun, moved swiftly to restore the old order. They abandoned the desert capital of Amarna, leaving it to be swallowed by sand. They reopened the temples, reinstated the priesthoods, and poured resources back into the cults of Ammon and the traditional gods. But the restoration was not peaceful, it was vengeful. A systematic campaign began to erase Akhenaten from history. His statues were torn down and smashed. His elegant reliefs on temple walls were defaced. His name was omitted from the official king lists, as if his reign had never happened. The very stone from his palaces and temples in Amarna was quarried and hauled away to be used as filler in new constructions, a final physical insult. The heretic king's vision of a single, loving sun god was replaced by a reaffirmation of the old, complex pantheon, but now backed by a terrified determination to never let such chaos happen again. Akhenaten's revolution shows the terrifying power a pharaoh wielded. He could break the world on a theological whim, and his legacy shows the even more terrifying power of a society's backlash, which sought not just to correct him, but to uncreate him entirely, leaving his strange, beautiful city as a ghostly warning in the desert. The backlash against Akhenaten was so complete it sought to bury his very memory, but for most pharaohs, the greatest fear was a far more physical violation. Their tombs were fortresses designed for eternity, yet the whispers say they left behind one final weapon, a curse upon any who dared disturb their sleep. This legend, the so-called curse of the pharaohs, exploded into modern consciousness with one event, the death of Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy English financier who backed Howard Carter's search for Tutankhamun's tomb, died in Cairo just months after the historic opening in 1922. The cause was blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite, but the timing was too perfect for the newspapers to ignore. They reported that at the exact moment of Carnarvon's death in England, the lights mysteriously flickered and went out across Cairo. His dog back home was said to have howled and dropped dead simultaneously. The media frenzy was instantaneous, weaving a tale of ancient magic punishing the arrogant intruders. More deaths followed among those connected to the excavation, each one fuel for the fire. The legend was born not from hieroglyphs, but from headlines, a perfect storm of coincidence and sensationalism that the public was eager to believe. Science, however, offers less mystical but equally deadly explanations. These tombs were sealed for thousands of years, creating unique and hazardous ecosystems. Researchers now point to potentially toxic molds and bacteria that could have thrived in the dark, organic-rich environment. Spores of aspergillus, a fungus known to cause severe respiratory illness, have been found in several mummies and tomb samples. For an individual like Lord Carnarvon, already in poor health, a concentrated blast of ancient pathogens upon breaking the seal could have been catastrophic. There were also likely chemical hazards, traces of pigments or embalming materials that over millennia produced toxic gases. The curse, in a very real sense, may have been a biological and chemical defense mechanism, an accidental one, but deadly all the same. It was not magic, but the natural consequence of opening a time capsule filled with organic decay. This modern myth obscures a much longer and darker history of violation, one that began almost as soon as the pharaohs were buried. The ancient tomb robbers were the first to defy the curses. These were not outsiders, but often the very workers who built the tombs, or local villagers who knew the desert valleys intimately. Papyrus records from the reign of Rameses IX detail the trial of robbers who looted the tomb of Pharaoh Sopkemsaf. Their confession is chillingly practical. They described breaking in by night, finding the king and queen's mummies adorned with gold, and simply melting down the precious metal for its value. To them, this was not a sacred crime, but a desperate business. They were driven by poverty and opportunity, seeing not a god, but a paycheck wrapped in linen. The pharaohs knew this threat was real. That is why tombs like Tutankhamun's were hidden in a remote valley, why corridors were filled with rubble, doors were sealed with royal necropolis stamps, and deep burial shafts were designed to trap the unwary. This was an ancient arms race between the builders of secrets and the breakers of seals, a struggle that most pharaohs ultimately lost. The tragedy is that this plunder did not end with antiquity. The early archaeologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries, while more systematic, were often driven by a treasure-hunting mentality. Their goal was frequently to fill the museums of Europe with spectacular objects, a race for trophies. In their haste to extract statues, jewelry, and coffins, they used methods we now see as brutally careless. They would clear a tomb with little regard for the context of where an object was found, discarding everyday items like pottery, textiles, or remains of food offerings that held invaluable clues about daily life and funerary practices. They treated the tomb like a jewel box to be emptied, not a crime scene to be meticulously documented. In doing so, they erased layers of meaning. A golden necklace is beautiful in a museum case, but we forever lost the knowledge of whether it was clutched in the mummy's hand, left at the foot of a statue, or placed in a specific chamber for a specific ritual purpose. That context is the true story, and it was shoveled away as debris in the rush for the glittering prize. So the darkness surrounding the pharaohs extends far beyond their reigns. It flows from the ancient robber's chisel to the modern excavator's shovel, a continuous thread of exploitation where the rest of the story, the fragile, non-glamorous truth of a civilization, was often the first casualty. The real curse may not be a supernatural vengeance, but the permanent silence we created by listening only for the echo of gold. The gold and the glory were always balanced by fear and shadow. From the crushing weight of divine authority that built pyramids on a foundation of suffering, to the bloody plots within palace walls where brother turned against brother, the history of Egypt's pharaohs is far from the serene, orderly picture we often see. These rulers were not just distant icons, but complex, flawed individuals operating in a world where power was absolute and often brutally enforced. A pharaoh could command the construction of timeless monuments and, in the same breath, order the erasure of a rival's very name from history. He could be the target of a murder plot by his own wives and children. and his tomb could become a site of both sacred ritual and desperate theft for centuries to come. Their legacies are a permanent mix of awe-inspiring achievement and deeply disturbing acts, two sides of the same golden coin. It forces us to ask a difficult question: can true greatness be built on a foundation of terror, or does the darkness ultimately tarnish the light? The answer is not simple, and perhaps that is the most enduring lesson. These stories are not just ancient history, they are a powerful study of what happens when a single person is elevated to the status of a living god, and the profound costs paid by the civilization that worships them. The silent stones of Egypt whisper of both wonder and warning. What do you think was the darkest aspect of pharaonic rule, the divine exploitation, the familial betrayal, or the desperate legacy of curses and robbery? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows of history, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past's greatest mysteries. Thanks for watching.